All right, let's dive right into today's topic. We're going to be breaking down a really interesting paper called Bounding the Boundless, all about fairness and equality in Islamic finance. It's by Shahid Sultan and Ambreen Sultan, and you can find it in the International Journal of Finance and Economics. It really gets you thinking, what actually makes any deal, any transaction, truly fair?
And this quote right here, it pretty much sets the stage for everything. It draws a really clear line in the sand. On one side, you have unjustly taking someone's property, which is forbidden, and on the other, you have trade, based on mutual agreement, which is encouraged. This very simple but powerful distinction is the bedrock of this entire discussion.
So let's zoom out for a second and look at the big picture idea behind all this, the principle of fairness and how we earn our living. And we're not just talking about a list of rules here, this is more like a whole philosophy. The paper makes a crucial point right away. This guidance isn't just for spiritual things, it's meant to be a comprehensive framework that covers every part of life, and that absolutely includes the practical, day-to-day business of how we make money.
You know, this idea is so central that there's a specific term for it, el-zin. It literally means a complete way of life. And that just reinforces that we're talking about an all-encompassing system, one that naturally has to include some pretty detailed economic principles.
So how does this actually play out? Well, the paper highlights a few of the approved ways to earn a living. Things like agriculture, labor, having a job. But take a look at the list. Trade has a really prominent spot. And this strong endorsement of trade is the key to what's coming next. And that brings us to this fundamental choice, a fork in the road that exists in pretty much any transaction. It's the choice between fair trade and unfair gain. There are two paths to getting something, but only one of them is okay.
So on one side, you have acquiring things justly, through trade, where everyone agrees. And on the other, you've got what the paper calls usurpation, which is just a way of saying you're taking something without proper consent or a fair exchange. It's a really stark contrast.
And this gets to the deeper why of it all. Trade isn't just okay because it's a way to get rich. Its main purpose is actually ethical. It's there to be the fair and just alternative to just taking what isn't yours. It's basically a built-in protection against exploitation. But what happens when that clear line between a fair deal and an unfair one starts to get a little blurry? This is where we run into the central problem that this paper is all about, the concept of riba. Okay, so what exactly is riba? Well, the paper defines it as a prohibited excess. The easiest way to think about it is an extra charge or amount that's tacked onto a deal, but for which you get nothing of real value in return. It's the exact tipping point where a fair exchange sours and becomes an unjust one. The article uses some really strong phrasing here. It suggests that riba is a way to disguise an unfair act inside what looks like a totally legitimate trade. It basically takes a simple crime, like theft, and dresses it up to look like a sophisticated, white-collar transaction. It's a hidden injustice. And verses like this one really drive home how serious this is. I mean, look at that powerful contrast. Riba, or usury, is described as something destructive that God eliminates. Meanwhile, charity, which is its total opposite, is something that increases. They're set up as two opposing moral forces. Okay, so we've established that riba is a big no-no. But that leads to a huge practical problem, right? In our incredibly complex world of finance and business, how do you actually spot it?
And this brings us to the core puzzle the paper is trying to solve. You have to ask these questions. If profit is also a kind of excess, what makes it different from forbidden riba? What is that one defining feature? And who gets it? The buyer, the seller, the lender? Getting answers to these is absolutely critical.
And that is precisely the author's mission here. Their goal is to untangle this knot of confusion and to try and provide some clear, solid answers to these really important questions about what riba truly is. But to do that, they first have to deal with a major hurdle. In the modern world, not everyone even agrees on how to define riba. There's actually a pretty significant divide among scholars that's grown over time. This timeline gives us some really helpful context. See, for centuries, the classical understanding of riba was pretty stable. But then the 19th century came along, and with it, colonial influence and modern banking. This new reality forced modern scholars to take a fresh look at the whole concept, which led to some very different interpretations.
This table really shows you the shift in thinking. The classical jurists, they were trying to define riba in all kinds of exchanges in their economy. But the modern scholars, they were suddenly faced with this brand new, complicated banking system, and so their focus narrowed way down to one very urgent question. Is modern bank interest the same thing as riba?
So you see, this split didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was driven by a real urgency to figure out this new banking situation. That sparked intense debates, and as the paper points out, it led some modern scholars to assume that maybe the classical jurists had just never considered something like a modern commercial loan.
And here's the consequence of all that, according to the paper. It's like the bridge connecting the classical legal tradition to modern finance got broken. In the rush to make sense of banking, the authors argue that the deep, detailed methodology of the classical jurists was often pushed aside, creating this gap between the concept's original foundation and today.
Which leaves us with the paper's central and, I think, very provocative question. The entire idea of riba was created to ensure justice in all our dealings. But if we've stopped using the original tools for spotting injustice, how can we really be sure our modern financial systems are living up to that same ethical standard? Something to think about.